because you're running a multi-tens of millions of dollars kind of business operating that place. So you would never look at another property while you were operating there. Whereas if you're looking at something like I'm managing, you're talking about needing 10 of those, to keep a staff of people busy. Now for me, leasing and managing my property, if I retired from Levancy and lived, if I didn't have any debt on a house or on a car, I might be able to live just on the management fee and leasing commissions for this one property. But that's really tough because it's so small, but a couple of properties like this, that would be enough. So again, what you do sort of varies by scale. And I was going to mention specialization, like brokers who lease and manage downtown, like especially who lease downtown properties, they'll get an assignment from something like United Airlines will say, we need 250,000 square feet in Chicago and we want 100,000 square feet in Houston. And the same brokerage firm will handle both assignments. And even the same point broker in their headquarters city like Chicago might be involved, even if they're not licensed in Texas, but the broker of record will be a Texas licensee down there. So you get all kinds of relationship things that are very significant. And again, the selling is different because you're selling to people at work, right? Not selling to people during their dinner hour at home. They kind of bug you about, are you ever going to list your house?
Does the leasing agent have rights to any more commissions after the expiration of the first lease agreement?
That's a great question. So to repeat it, make sure everybody heard it, like it's on the recording. The question is, does a leasing agent have additional rights to income? So the procuring cause for a lease is for that lease, not for future options and not for future renewals. However, it is very common practice, and I underscore very common practice, for sophisticated commercial real estate brokers to have written in the leases that they are entitled to a commission when the thing renews or extends or an option is exercised, which for me, as a property owner who is counting on future renewal income without having to pay the leasing commission, or as a fee manager who's also hoping that I'm going to be able to collect that commission by just renewing the existing tenant in the future, I find that kind of thing problematic and hugely annoying. However, if I was a tenant rep broker and trying to make myself as much money as possible, I would also try and get that built into that sort of lease. So that's an interesting area for me. Now I will oftentimes push back because I'm affected twice. I'm affected as a property investor and I'm affected as the fee manager managing the same property. And I have found that a lot of those brokers will back off. If I push hard enough, because I'm not just the other broker, I'm also the owner on the side where their tenant wants to lease, they will oftentimes say, we'll waive that. But if I don't push back, then yeah, they would be entitled to a full commission every 5, every 10 years, whenever that tenant releases. And that's another thing about tenant rep brokers that you should probably be aware when you're looking at dollars. So when we talked about co-op commissions in Chapter 5, particularly for house sales or any kind of sales, right? There's approximately plus or minus 50-50. It could be split however the brokers arrange and the clients agree, but it's not at all uncommon for the listing agent to get half the fee, the broker's fee, and the buyer's agent to get half the fee. Or if it's off that a little bit, it's off that by a little bit. But in the tenant rep business in commercial and industrial real estate, if you have a highly visible, very desirable national credit tenant or even international credit tenant, you can, as a tenant rep, oftentimes insist on a full fee for yourself. So for example, if that happens at my property, then as the broker managing and leasing the building, I'll get a half a commission for repping the owner. And instead of the other half of the commission going to the tenant rep, they'll get a full fee. So they'll literally make twice as much as I will. And the building will have to pay a commission and a half. The worst case I've seen in that scenario was when L'Oreal, the French cosmetics company, was looking for space years ago. We were managing and leasing a building in Chicago, and they were looking to lease like 20,000 feet for 10 years, and we had a space, and they were pretty serious about it. Well, they ended up not leasing. The broker that they had a national U.S. representation deal with was on the East Coast, and that broker did not have a Chicago office. So that broker was entitled to a full fee. They hired a broker in Chicago to represent them here who was entitled to a full fee. And as the building managing and leasing firm, we got a half. So if L'Oreal had rented from that particular building owner, that building owner would pay 2.5 times the normal leasing fee for that 10-year deal. And that was one of the sticking points, because that owner was willing to do it, but insisted on putting that in as higher rent amortized over the 10 years so they could recover that higher cost, which is one of the reasons why I think L'Oreal bought, because the costs ultimately were too high. Now, L'Oreal could have pushed back against their broker and said, no, we're not going to, we want the deal, but we're not going to allow, we're not going to agree to pay rent that covers that. But eventually they probably found a building somewhere desperate enough for a tenant like L'Oreal with the visibility that they took them, and it wasn't L'Oreal's issue, it was ultimately the property owner who paid for that big fee. So again, like I described with the Glidden story, you get a whole wide range of possibilities here of the kinds of things that can happen, or the kinds of things that can work out. So, sophisticated parties agree that you're going to get commissions over and over and over again. That's a contract. You're entitled to that money. But the thing you remember, as a broker, you're not party to the lease. So that's why I think ultimately tenant reps have to back off if the owners push and say, no, we're not going to do that, because they're not parties to the deal, and their fiduciary duty runs to their tenant, and they can't really disadvantage their tenant by insisting on their own future commission income, as far as how I would interpret the License Act. I don't know if commercial brokers even think about the license law, honestly. It's really designed to protect consumers, not sophisticated business parties, even though technically, legally, I think it's supposed to apply across the board. All right, so getting on to renting the property here on the slide. As I mentioned before, this is one of the most critical aspects of managing and leasing, is selecting the tenants. So, one of the first things you need to be able to do is know what a property should rent for. So to do that, you do a rent survey. This is where you go out and you do a market analysis of the rent amount. So what are other competing properties charging? Right? And so this is an interesting debate. Let's just say we're talking about managing an apartment complex. Interesting debate as to how you should do this. So if you're managing an apartment complex and you need to know what you should be renting the property for, you need to know a couple of things. You need to know not only competing rents, but what the occupancy or vacancy rates are. So an occupancy rate is what's the percentage of units in your building that are currently leased. At any moment in time, you can census that and say, how many vacancies do we have? And the vacancies make up the vacancy rate by percentage. Occupancy and vacancy added together have to add up to 100%, because that's the whole property. In apartments, you're typically hoping for 96, 97, maybe 98%. And then you've got to know what the vacancy and occupancy rates are in other buildings when you compare the rents. And so how do you do that? Where do you go to get that information? Because it's not public record. So imagine you're the manager of an apartment complex, and your owner's telling you, go out and find out what the occupancy rates are and the rent, and the rent levels are for competing property. How are you going to find it out? You're going to dress up in a costume and go over there and pretend to be a tenant, or you're going to call on the phone and disguise your voice and go, hey, I was just wondering what you're renting your property for and what your occupancy rate is. Or do you just call them up on the phone and say, you have the same problem that I have. I manage a competing property. You need to know what we're renting for. You need to know what our occupancy rate is, and I need to know the same thing. Do you want to just trade data? So let's take a minute and talk briefly about the pros and cons of those two. What's the problem with sort of being surreptitious and underhanded and not, telling people who you are? It's just a little bit weird sounding, isn't it? It's sort of, go in costume and, or disguise yourself. All right, so, what are the pros and cons of just talking directly to the other side?
The antitrust?
Yeah, that's it exactly. That's the major con. Even if your intent is not to fix rental prices or rental rates between the apartment complex, if you're talking to your competition every 30 days or every quarter about this, how do you prove that you're not conspiring? So back we are to the old, get in your rusty old car and go over there in your blue jeans and your, whatever fake dentures to look like somebody different every 30 days to collect the rental prices. So there's probably with a wink and a nod, they know, but this is something that staff people have to do. I'm told that gas station people do the same thing. Get in your car, drive around, price the competing gas stations, bring that information back, call in the dispatcher, and tell them how to set the prices. Because you can't pick up the phone and call a gas station and get a price, because that's an antitrust concern. Because what if it's your competition asking you? So it's an interesting kind of thing, but you need to know what's going on in the market. And you have to census that in some way. You gotta survey your competition somehow. So handle that how you will, but for apartments in particular, I don't think people are talking to each other much anymore, even though I think that would make the most sense because of antitrust concerns. Selecting tenants, screening people, this is huge. Remember, you know, this is where all the work is. So let's back up and point out how universal this kind of thing is. So if I ask you to tell me, how long will it take you to paint this room? Right? I want you to look around the room right now, and I want you to get a sense of how long would it take you to paint this room? So let's just sort of talk through the process. So when it comes to painting this room, what's the very first thing you're going to do in here?
Right?
Okay,
Take
well,
all the fixture stuff out of the way.
you're going to move furniture. You're either going to take it out of the room or you're going to put it in the center of the room. And then what are you, if it's in the center of the room, what are you going to do with it? Tarp it in some manner. What are you going to do after you've done that?
Take off the fixtures?
Yeah, you're going to take anything off the wall that doesn't belong, that you need, or if you don't do that, what else would you do?
Tape it off.
You tape it off. And what are you going to do at the ceiling edge? Tape it off. What are you going to do at the vinyl base? Tape it off. So now, you know, we've got all this time, effort, and energy involved in doing everything except for painting. So when we talk about renting, it all comes down to all the work you do in selecting. Renting, you know, to people is easy if you've got the right tenants, because they just send you a check every month, and they only call you when when the decomposition that naturally happens in the world kicks in. You know, the roof is leaking, or the snow needs to be shoveled, or whatever the problem is. So I mean, again, all of the work is preparatory when it comes to leasing. If you have good tenants, you know, and you maintain the property well, you're proactive and you stay out in front, property management and leasing is not that complicated a thing to do in my mind. How do you want to position yourself in the market? You want to be, you know, lower than your competing properties, higher than rents, higher quality? What kind of tenants are you looking for? You know, you want to be fully occupied, partially occupied? You know, it all depends upon what you're trying to do. How are properties staged? You know, this is a big deal for apartment complexes in particular, but also corporate office parks. They got, you know, big landscaping contracts, and you know, got to have the right flowers and planting beds and all this stuff. That attracts people. You know, that architecture, that feel really matters. So then maintaining that stuff matters a lot, and you'll attract certain tenants based upon these other factors. And then we'll talk about advertising here next. So as you're trying to reach certain tenants, you got to ask yourself, who am I trying to reach? So for industrial property, I recommend using billboards, you know, along highways. Why billboards on highways and along roads? Why for industrial property especially? Traffic patterns, trucking. Can't just go down any old street, can't just put an industrial complex anywhere. Access to an interstate highway and major roads that don't have things like 4-ton weight limits. You know, you need to know that your truck traffic can get in and out easily. So how do you scout that? You get in the car and you go scout that. So then you see, you know, billboard kind of advertising, that kind of thing. Trade publications that target those particular industries, meaning, you know, magazines that are towards manufacturers, for example, or whatever. Maybe they're selling equipment. You could also put advertisement for an industrial complex or park or building. You know, if you have an industrial building that's like 400 feet long, why not put up like a 400-foot long banner that's like 20 feet high? You know, people can see that from a long way off. That's another thing you could do. And then these sites, loopnet.com and CoStar.com. I don't think CoStar does industrial, but certainly LoopNet does. So if you want to look at these websites, you can go there anytime you want. These are, CoStar is a membership only, so I don't think you can see any properties. You can go to LoopNet, it's not membership only, but you can't see very much if you don't pay for some kind of a membership. I pay $650 a year roughly for a LoopNet membership, and they're constantly trying to get me to buy a premium membership. Depending upon how much you pay, you get different kinds of services and things. So if I've got more commercial type property listed, I'll spend more money with LoopNet. I listed an apartment building a couple of years ago and just paid for an extra 90 days of service rather than for a full year to get better exposure. Office buildings, now we're not talking about billboards and large banners anymore, trade publications and signage on the building. You know, again, you know, people might be working there or doing business there or whatever. You can find other businesses that are in local offices and send them mailers. What if their leases are about to expire? You know, maybe the dentist is willing to move out of their current space. Maybe their rent's about to jump and they're looking for someplace better. Maybe there's a bad landlord nearby. Mail all their businesses. Mail them consistently until they realize that maybe they can have a better business life if they move to your building. If you're going to rent office space to the state of Illinois or the federal government, you have to bid that. It's a publicly bid kind of scenario, or it's at least bid to them in the way any other kind of bid thing is. So you need to subscribe to the Illinois Register or the Federal Register to get the notice of when the Social Security Administration or the SBA or the Department of Justice or whomever is looking for space. The General Services Administration is a big provider of space for federal government agencies. Central Management Services does all of this for Illinois. You can get these things emailed to you, but again, they're not going to come to you through a broker or through a yard sign like these other places. And again, sites LoopNet and CoStar, which are paid services, particularly if you're listing properties. Residential, meaning apartments or houses, whatever, Craigslist is probably the best place. Think about where, you know, in a case like this, where would you advertise your place for rent? Or where would you go to find a place if you were looking to rent? You know, you're a consumer like everybody else. Craigslist is the new king. It was always as classified ads in the paper. It's still very strong. Much better for both of those than the MLS. So even as a broker, I'm not sure if I was renting my house, I would probably put it in the MLS, but I'm not sure I would bother. The odds are it'll rent out of Craigslist or the newspaper, probably Craigslist. If you had one of those one places to list your house for rent, Craigslist would be the spot. Redirectional signs, right? Of course, you can kind of put them up on a corner to direct people into your subdivision or into your apartment complex or whatever. Yard signs, same thing as with sales. And then maybe billboards, particularly for apartments. You know those billboards, you've seen them. If you lived here, you'd be home by now. You know, that kind of clever sort of thing. Retail, trade publications that are targeting those kinds of retail businesses. Trade shows like ICSC, the International Convention for Shopping Centers. There are tons of lease deals done at ICSC. It's a huge deal out in Las Vegas every year. It goes on for about a week, I think. It's a major trade show. I've never been. I've had broker associates that I sponsored who had gone there years ago when we managed some retail buildings. And I get invites from other brokers from time to time when they, because on their mailing list I'm both a principal and a broker, so when they look at the principal side, they invite me to go along to see their display at ICSC. They're not going to pay for it, but they just invite me to come see it. Window signs, right? Vacancy, why not put signs all over? The pylon signs, so you got, Whole Foods and, TJ Maxx and, space available, right? I mean, you put right up there on the road signs, people will see that. And then again, the websites. Again, there's no MLS per se for brokers, and this is why you have to do so much hunting as a commercial broker. It's a lot of work to generate these deals, though you get paid well in the long run. So back to this basic idea of selecting tenants, and I hope that answers your question, Kate, and looking at some of those other things. And I would go, and this is here as a list for anybody who's interested, download this and have that. So screening, again, what's somebody's credit history? Run a background check, criminal background check, at least statewide. How many of you are familiar with the law in Aurora that you can't, you can't rent a house to anybody in Aurora anymore? Anybody. If you don't live in the house, you can't rent a house in Aurora without doing a criminal background check on your tenant. It's municipal law. If I have my house that I raised my family in the city of Aurora, and I want to rent it to one of my daughters for $100 a month, and I'm not living in that house, I have to have a criminal background check run on there. Even though, honestly, I don't really want to know. But that's how the law works. And the house has to be inspected once a year. Huh?
Who follows up on that?
The City of Aurora Inspection Department, and you pay a fee. Every house effectively has to be licensed and registered so that the city can collect enough fees to support this. It's a police-driven initiative that was first done in Schaumburg, and it's been in law in Aurora now 3 or 4 years. I don't even remember what the act is called. I hate it so much I don't want to look at it. But the idea is that it's a police-driven idea their thinking is that if landlords are held to account and criminal background checks are required, landlords might not rent to undesirables and then we won't have as much gang activity. I think it's a bunch of horseshit and overreaching by the city, but that's what happens when you let the police make the decisions on private property matters.
Is that relatively new? We bought a house that we rent to our daughter, basically, and they wanted me to take a class.
That's it. That's part of that.
I told them it was for my daughter, and they said, never mind.
Is she paying you rent?
She's making the payments, basically.
Oh, so she's making the house payments?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that might be different then.
Well, we didn't tell her.
Yeah.
They told her with her daughter.
No, that shouldn't make a difference. Now, this is one of the things I wrote to them and told them that I thought, I tell you what, I was one ugly man at that class. There was, how many people were in that room? 200-300 people or something, whatever, and I reamed the guy that heads that department. First of all, they started the meeting 15 minutes late, and you know, I'm a loud and large guy, and people do not bother or scare me. And so, you know, I just told them in no uncertain terms, you told me I had to be here early, if not 15 minutes after, when are you gonna start this meeting? And the people who ran the meeting were two armed civil service, but they were two armed police officers, which I also found annoying. And by the way, it was the worst 2-minute explanation of fair housing I have ever heard anybody attempt. It was pitiful. I also spoke up against that, and a bunch of people said, we really don't care what you think, we wanna get out of here. But on the other hand, would you please explain to us how that law really works? Just awful, 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 awful. So the way the law reads, as far as I understand, or I've not read the statute, is if she's paying rent to you, that whole thing is obligated to be licensed, registered, you have to take the class, etc. I remember specifically counseling somebody at that meeting who was going to do the same thing. They were going to rent their house to their son. I said, sell it to them on a land contract. Don't rent it to them. Just get up and walk out and don't do this. Because somebody, if nobody's done this already, somebody needs to sue the city of Aurora and say this is overreaching. Because the longer this goes on, the less likely that's going to happen. And I have a former student who was thinking about trying to do that as a property manager in the city. But I think you'd have to be an owner to have standing to be able to do that. An owner who was renting to an adult offspring, because that's where I think it's overreaching.
What's the parameters for the background check? So
State
if
of
they don't
Illinois.
have a good, if they have a criminal background, you can't rent to them, or is that? your
No, you
discretion?
can, the city does not tell you you cannot rent to them.
Okay.
You can rent to anybody you want to. We just want to let you know that those are people with a criminal background.
Now, I've been living in my place for 5.5 years, so you said this took effect, what, like 4 years ago, roughly?
Yeah, but you're supposed to be, if you're living in Aurora now as a tenant,
Mhm.
yeah, you're supposed to.
So they're supposed to do a background check on it?
No, you're supposed to have it run and pay for it and give it to them. And the city of Aurora is supposed to be doing an annual inspection, and they're
Yeah, they
supposed,
do that.
and they're supposed to ask for proof of that criminal background check every single year.
Really?
Yep, they don't look at it, and they don't keep it. There's also a lease addendum, or a lease language that has to be included as part of that lease. Again, it's only in the city of Aurora, but if that lease addendum is not there, then the property owner can be fined.
Okay.
And it's specific language, they don't keep a copy of it, they just wanna see it. So they're trying to make it like, yeah, we're not really meddling in your affairs, we're just telling you how to, you know, do the screening part of it. My problem is that law creates multiple classes of people. So if you are a property owning individual in the city of Aurora, you are the elite, because you don't have that problem. Your house doesn't get inspected, you don't get a license, nobody runs a criminal background check on you. But if you are a tenant of any kind, renting in the city of Aurora as a resident, then you are obligated to do this criminal background check, and that house has to be inspected, and that makes you a second-class citizen. And if you have a criminal background of any kind that shows up in that statewide, it's not a nationwide, it's a statewide criminal background check that's required, you are now a third-class citizen, because you know there are landlords who now will not rent to you. And I think that's really a dangerous dangerous slope to go down, to say, anybody who has one single offense, we want to single them out regardless of what it is, so that every landlord in town will know that they should think twice about renting to them. And I think that for political leadership is completely inexcusable and irresponsible. Now, if you want to say to people, you know, 3 strikes, you're out, that kind of thing, but we have this horrible 1 strike, you're out policy that I mentioned the other night, and it's just getting worse. So that's how the law works, and that's how it's supposed to work, as I understand it. If I wouldn't go probing around if you're surviving without them knowing or bothering you, but I have friends that I they pay me about $100 a year basically to act as their property manager, and all I do is arrange the inspections and go, the city, because they live out of the country. Literally, he's in Afghanistan and she's in Colombia, and they're trying to manage a marriage, and they have to have their friggin' house inspected every year. And the people they're renting to, family friends, people that I know personally, people that they know personally, yet the whole thing's gotta be inspected. And repeatedly, and repairs done. I mean, last year the repair bill was like $6,000 or $7,000. Things to bring it up to code, where if you were living there yourself, none of those things would be required. One of the reasons why when I move back to this area, I probably would not move to Aurora. I got enough, I'm up to my eyeballs with the city of Aurora's rules already. I understand regulation, but over-regulation is sinful. All right, so, this kind of thing is part of what you do, credit history, background check, and references. Keeping in mind that if you're renting to somebody who's maybe a little marginal, you could get a guarantor, a secondary signer. And when I rent commercial and industrial space, so if I get a couple of eye doctors that come to my building and I have a partnership or a company or whatever, and they want to rent and put their eye doctor business there for 20 years, awesome. They're going to sign personal guarantees. National credit tenants, I don't do that. Anybody else, it's, personal guarantees. So I want to know that I've got somebody to chase for at least money. And we've had to do that in the past. We had specifically had a tenant at one point in time who not only failed to pay us our rent, but they took that money and they used the money they didn't pay us for rent and made it as part of their cash down payment on a building so they could move out of our space. Now, if that isn't annoying. So I not only liened their new building, I liened their houses. And nobody could refinance, they couldn't move and do anything. Eventually, we not only got our money, eventually meaning in about a year, but we also got all of our legal fees and costs, etc. That's just, Oh, and then it was a nonprofit, by the way. Interesting way to run a nonprofit. Okay, so collecting rent is a big deal. This is part of what you do. You're going to rent to people, you got to get the money from them. So this is one of those licensed activities, the rent collection process. When is it due? How is it paid? Do you have a grace period? Are there late fees? Is there interest after a certain period of time? At what point in time are you going to start chasing these people? The lease should define some of this, but part of it is policy. State of Illinois has been in our building since February of 1992. They have not been current since March of 1992. They're 2 to 3 months late, always. Do I chase them? Nope. I kind of like it when they're 7 or 8 months late because then they also pay us interest. We make a lot of money on interest. There were years when we were making $3,000 a year in interest and late fees from the state. We didn't have to ask for it. They just automatically paid it because they're required under the Comp Payment Act. So I don't really care when they pay me. So, and how are you going to handle a particular tenant? I sometimes put my invoices out late. So East Aurora Schools is grant funded for the Early Childhood Center. They have to have an invoice from us in order to get money from their grant funder. If I submit the grant late, if I submit the invoice late and they submit late, I always make a point of telling them, do not add late fees. I'm not asking for late fees. We're late, you're not. At one point in time when I had the previous property management firm, an accountant handling the building, they were as much as 3 months late submitting invoices. I don't know how that was happening or what they were doing. And so the school principal called me and I said, don't pay any prepayment, don't pay any fees. We'll get it taken care of. And now I'm sometimes a couple of weeks late, but never more than that. Again, so how are you going to handle it? Where some payments are made electronically today, that's pretty handy. I have all the rent payments made to a post office box for the building. You can have drop boxes for apartments. Tenants need to know exactly where the rent's supposed to go so they know how and when to get it there. If they don't know when or where to drop it off, how do you ding them for a late fee if they just took it to the wrong location or mailed it to your other office or something? All that stuff's got to be really clear in the lease when and where the rent is due. Again, what the lease says and how you handle, you can always waive somebody's late fees, but there should be in there. There's got to be some teeth behind that when the rent is due kind of thing. If they're late, what's the grounds for termination? Not only in the lease, but also how do you want to handle it, right? When do you want to push somebody out? When do you want to go through the process of eviction? Remembering this is a licensed activity, and then there is an exemption to the escrow account. So if you, as a broker, remember we talked about the security deposit, and security deposit being different than rent, but security deposit being the same thing as earnest money, and earnest money having to be held in an escrow account. So if the brokerage firm on a commercial or industrial property, or on any property really. So if the broker, but it particularly makes sense on a commercial industrial property where the security deposits are large. If the firm is not gonna hold earnest money or a security deposit, that needs to be in bold print in the lease according to the License Act. So that the tenant understands that, oh, my money is not in an escrow account, it's being commingled, because commingling is legal for a property owner. So when a security deposit is paid to the Indian Trail Business Center, it goes straight into the operating account. And we owe like 40 grand in security deposits when people leave. That's just part of that cash I was telling you about. We can use it for whatever. I could use that money to distribute to the partners. All I have to do with that security deposit is be able to do what with it? Pay it back when the tenant leaves. If their lease is valid, then I owe them the money. So the property owner can commingle money all the time. And there's an exception here too, in the License Act. If you as a real estate broker are the 100% owner of a property, you can also commingle the security deposit. You don't have to have it in a separate account. But you have to be the 100% owner. So in other words, it's a real estate licensee who owns a house, and you're renting out that house, and they give you a $1,200 security deposit, you can stick that right in your personal checking account, as long as you're the sole owner of that property. If you're the main owner with a bunch of partners, you can't do it. It's got to have to go into an escrow account, or be clear in the lease that it's not going into an escrow account. Tenants are your clients' customers. Right? Tenants are the customers of the building, whether it's a house or what it is. So you have to treat them well. Good customer service. That's what this is all about. Good customer service. There's something to be said for having minimal turnover. On the other hand, you also need to keep the rents elevated. It's really easy to keep a tenant by never increasing the rent. And then 10 years into the future, what's happened? Your building's way under rented in terms of what you're getting. You may go, I didn't have to turn them over. Well, okay. But you can stay below the market rents just enough without having to stay way below the market rents. I mean, it's all about maximizing the value and the cash flow of the property. How do you do that if you're charging 10, 20, 30, 40% below the market rent? You can't do that. If your tenants are treated well, then they should refer people. Hey, we really like it here. You'd like it here too. People own home businesses go to chamber meetings. And if they're unhappy with you as a landlord, or you're unhappy with the landlord because of you as a property manager, other people say, how do you like renting there? Oh, screw that, I'm gonna get out as soon as I can. That's not what you want. You want, oh, it's great, it's awesome. When we have problems, they take care of them. Or we never have problems, whatever. You want people to, sell for you. So you treat your tenants well, so they encourage other people. Small businesses talk to one another. If the tenants like it, more likely you could raise the rent more if they're happy if you treat them well. So solve problems. Do what people need. I tell all of the tenants in the building that I manage that I teach full-time at Levancy. And that if they call me and I don't respond immediately, I'm probably crawling in front of a classroom. But feel free to email me or text me. I give them all the possible contact information. And sometimes I'm there at ridiculous hours to help them solve their problems. That's my responsibility, to make that as seamless and painless a tenancy experience as what they can have. And maybe that's why the state's been there for 20-some years, and the school district is going to end up having been there for more than a dozen, and we had lived there for 31 years before they ended up moving. So I mean, you need to treat people well. Also, you'll have fewer problems with tenants, so your operating expenses might be lower, but that's certainly something you want to be able to do, is keep your operating expenses down. Happy tenants don't, do dumb things necessarily, like bring all their trash from home and put it in your dumpster because they hate your guts. Communicating is a big deal. So if you have inspections coming up, let people know in advance, well in advance, weeks in advance. I'm thinking about repaving the parking lot later this summer. I probably should be notifying the tenants already, but I'm just not quite certain whether I'm going to pull that trigger because of the amount of money involved. But I need to let them know a long time in advance so that they don't just show up one day and go, oh crap, where am I supposed to park this week? In fact, I'll probably coordinate that. When is the school closed? When do the state offices have the most number of holidays? And how can we section that, phase that part of that parking lot that we have so they always have a place to park? So think through things in advance. Minimize unnecessary disruptions. When the school district built their building next door last year, a couple of years ago, whenever it was, they needed to tie into the water main on our property. So they called me one day, like at, I don't know, 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock in the morning and said, we gotta tie in this water main, we gotta shut your water off for a couple of hours. We're gonna do it, you know, at whatever, at 2 o'clock today. And I said, wait, okay, hang on, let this wash over me for a minute. You're calling me as a neighboring property owner and giving me no notice, and I pledged them all kinds of guarantees against school districts, big tenant of ours. You're giving me no time, and now you're telling me to call my tenants and tell them to all go home because they're not gonna be able to use the toilet? I said, you guys can come back at 6 o'clock tonight. Well, we'll have to pay overtime, and we don't know if the city inspector can come out. I said, you can not only pay your people overtime, you can offer the city inspector overtime, because I'm not telling my tenants they have to, you know, do something different because you didn't plan properly. You know, so you gotta think about that. I don't wanna disrupt my tenants. Had I not thought about how will this impact my tenants, I would have said, I don't care what you do with the water, I don't live in the building. You have to think about that from their perspective. Some buildings, apartments in particular, have rules. Major office buildings do as well. So you need to look at what those rules are and make sure they make sense for the tenants that you have, and sometimes maybe change the rules to fit them. Standard rules give you opportunities to discipline tenants or penalize them or do whatever. Rules changes in a commercial industrial building can deal with things like smells, noises. You want to have you're a manufacturer and you want to have an equipment demonstration room in an office building where you're going to bring potential buyers of your, you know, air actuated tool equipment, and so you're going to be going, you know, against some fake concrete wall or something. Tenants, you know, in other locations don't want that happening. So the building rules may prohibit the actual use of real tools because of the vibration to the building or the noise or the smell. Some places where people are cooking, like restaurants or whatever, that smell can waft through a building. So again, rules help you avoid these kinds of problems, and then you don't have to draft or put rules in every lease. You just refer to the building rules the way that CC&Rs are referred to in a sales agreement. Helpful to have that. Property management should involve a lot of standard forms. Examples are move-in, move-out forms. Anybody done one of those when you rented an apartment? If not, if you rented a truck or a car where you walk around and they check off all the body damage before you leave so you don't have to pay for that later, that's what a move-in and move-out forms are for. When you take an apartment, if there's already dents and dings as a tenant, you don't want those dents and dings to take out of your security deposit later. So you'd want to walk around and agree to that. Well, the landlord also wants to have a record of the property was in perfect condition. So you can say later, hey, you walked around the apartment with us and you didn't note any damage, and we walk in here now and looks like your cat's been using this corner as a scratching post. So, you know, then you can ding them for that repair. So that's the move-in, move-out process, and you're kind of standardizing that and doing it consistently and having good habits. Handling tenant complaints. When tenants call up to complain, you have to listen and you have to do what you can unless there really isn't anything you can do. Again, good customer service, you should be a good listener, that kind of thing. I put a lot of time, effort, and energy into managing my tenants' complaints as best I can, you know, regardless of whether they're current on rent. I know they'll get current with me eventually, or they're close enough, and I'd rather have them than not have them. I don't say to them, no, I'm not going to come out and fix your roof leak until you pay us the $3 grand you owe us. Never had that conversation. Just go out and do the best I can to fix it. And emergencies. You know, what do you do when the fire department calls your cell phone at 2 a.m., you know, and you're really exhausted and you can hardly see straight, but they're saying, hey, you got to come out to the property. You know, I mean, that kind of stuff happens for property managers sometimes. Maintaining the property. What's your role as a property manager? You're not cutting the grass, you're not painting the building, but you're supervising somebody, either building employees, which would be the case with large developments like Willis Tower, or independent contractors, which is what I use in all cases. You know, so the guy who does the lawn or who plows the snow or who patches the roof, those are all independent contractors. That's my responsibility to supervise them and keep track of what they're doing and hire somebody else if I don't think the people I'm using are doing a good job. I put down here size matters and then complexity matters. So again, the larger a project you have, the more likely you're going to have more to supervise and the more likely you have employees and less contractors. And we mentioned that already. The complexity of the property matters. I like the 45,000 square foot building that I manage because it's single story, it's really simple, it doesn't move a lot, there's not a whole lot of complexity to it. I've also been involved in much older buildings, you know, a century old or more, that have environmental issues and cracking concrete, and they've been remodeled in different ways at different times, and they're really complicated. And so it takes a lot more time, effort, and energy to manage that. You've got to get a bigger fee for that, and you're gonna spend a lot more time, you're gonna have a lot more tenant issues. So again, how you manage the property, how you structure it, depends upon how large it is and how complicated the property is to manage. Maintenance issues of various sorts, and you could get a test question on this area. There's different kinds of maintenance stuff. Right? So there's different ways to look at any kind of problem, but with maintenance in particular, we can categorize these pretty consistently. So preventive or preventative, either way, either word is correct, synonyms. You know, things like painting, right? You paint the steel so it doesn't rust. You put parking lot seal coating on there to hold the parking lot together and keep weeds from growing up and other kinds of things. Quarterly or maybe annual inspections of your rooftop heating and cooling equipment, you know, changing air filters, those sorts of things. Charging up the air conditioners at the beginning of the cooling season. Those kinds of things to make sure that you avoid long-term problems. That's preventive maintenance. And I don't know that you need to worry about all these things in great detail as far as exactly which is which, but understanding that maintenance falls into different categories is important. So repair or corrective maintenance, now that you have had a problem, you know, now that the heating and cooling equipment does have a problem, you do have to replace or repair the compressor or something like that. Now you're going to go ahead and do that. Routine maintenance would be much more routine things like cutting the grass and putting down fertilizer or weed killer or other kinds of things. Things that you're going to just have to come back and continue to do. They're not necessarily structural, but you have to do them on a regular basis. This is just one example. Routine maintenance could also include, you know, maintaining the pH level in the swimming pool if you have an apartment complex. Glass cleaning is a big deal, as you know, windows and other kinds of things. You know, think about the window washing equipment in the downtown high-rises. There's a lot of money invested in that equipment. Pest control, you know, that's rodents, all kinds of things. I had a manager at a tenant call me up one time and said, I have a dead bat in my toilet. Now somebody tell me how that happens. How does anybody end up with a dead bat in their toilet? So I had to hire a bat specialist, because you call the pest control places, they're like, no, that's like an endangered species. We can't touch those. It's not like mice and rats and things or whatever. There's some animals we can take care of and others we can't. So I called, I don't remember the name of the guy's company, but it was like the Bat Company or something, whatever. But I mean, that's where they took care of specialty kinds of animals. So the guy came out, and I was there with him. He walked through. It took about 30 minutes. I paid him twice what he asked. He only asked for like $75. And there actually were two guys. But I figured the trip was worth more than that. But the whole idea was he could pinpoint, okay, this is a lone bat. There are no bat colonies in your building, and it probably happened exactly this way. And he laid out the whole story that made logical sense about what it was, and the tenant was satisfied, and the bat was disposed of, and everybody was happy. You know, not exactly technically pest control, because a bat, you know, really isn't a pest. I guess it's a protected species, but that bat somehow got into our building and was wandering around, you know, flying around up in the structure, and who knows. All right, looking at like tenant improvements or alterations, this is kind of sort of construction-related maintenance. So just updates between tenancies, whether it's a painting in an apartment or a complete gut and remodel because you had one kind of tenant and they're moving out and you have to start all over and lay it out for somebody else. Or you might have complete reconstruction, you're gonna put an addition on, or you know, the new tenant at the edge of your building, whether it's a drugstore or an ice cream parlor, wants to have a drive-through. So you gotta, you know, make some modifications to the site, cut a hole in the wall, or whatever, to take care of all that stuff. I mean, you have any number of things that will go on a property. So there's that part of the maintenance. Now this is not the same kind of maintenance category, but I wanted you to have heard the term. I don't know if this is even in the text, but deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance is maintenance that hasn't been done, but that should have been scheduled and has been done by now. Deferred maintenance is what you call it when you drive up to a property and you go, oh, that needs a lot of work. That's deferred maintenance. That's a way of saying, well, you know, yes, I should probably replace the parking lot, but I could patch it one more year. Yes, I could possibly, you know, break out some of that cracked concrete and repair it, but I think I could maybe caulk those joints or patch that a little bit or do what I have to do to get by. That's the idea of deferred maintenance. And so you don't have enough money in the reserves to repair the roof, but you could get enough money to patch it. That replacement is deferred maintenance. So just, any number of reasons, lack of money, lack of available people, weather delays, all kinds of reasons why you might have deferred maintenance. If you're a building investor, you want to look at that because that devalues the property, right? Because you're going to have to do that maintenance when you first buy it. Environmental issues, which we'll talk at more length about in chapter 22. Still got a lot of slides, but they're going to start to go pretty quick here. This is, something that a property manager should do, but you don't have to spend, a lot of time sort of worrying about this now. Environmental audits. Who do you have in the building? You got a dry cleaner? Are they treating on site with chemicals? Do they ever spill any? You got a paint store? They ever lose a 5-gallon bucket of latex in the loading dock and then they washed it down the floor drain with water? You have a photo finishing place in there that has any kind of heavy metals in the process. These are all kind of innocuous, if you look at them from a consumer standpoint, tenant. That could be nightmare tenants when you're talking about managing a property from an environmental standpoint. Gas station, auto repair, all kinds of things that can be huge problems. Today, energy usage is a big deal. I get, particularly electricians, I'll ask them to come to the property sometime and say, what would it cost us to replace all the overhead light fixtures? How much money could the tenants save in electricity if we replace them? Because, they will pay for themselves sometimes in 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. Same thing with the rooftop units. I'm counting on the tenants having, energy savings. If the tenants have energy savings, they can afford to pay the rent, or they're more likely to rent there. Hazardous materials of all kinds, again, that we'll talk about in chapter 22. It's these kinds of commercial, industrial type properties, older properties in particular, but not always, where you're likely to see those. Manufacturing, oh my God, what are they manufacturing and on what basis? They're using cutting oils? Where does that stuff go? Does it ever get to the concrete floor and then seep through it? I mean, because if it gets into the ground in any way, it's now hazardous. Now, that kind of thing has to be dealt with in some way. PCBs are used in transformers, or were used to cool transformers. If you're doing certain kinds of manufacturing processes today, we're still processing with some of these heavy metal kinds of things. So there have been whole industrial parks developed designed to entice heavy manufacturing people to come and be there, so that the water reclamation district of a particular area can just focus on knowing, okay, we're going to have to be able to take all these hazardous wastes in and reclaim them before that water gets into the system. Whereas if you don't know where those manufacturers are, you can't afford to do it that way. So, I mean, again, what are you managing? Fumes, odors, smokestack stuff, whatever. You got odors just from certain kinds of, what I like to refer to as that new car smell, right? New car smell is awesome, but according to some people, it might be killing you because you're inhaling these fumes that you shouldn't be inhaling. There's a new car smell, if you will, to a brand new carpeted and painted space if you're not avoiding the VOCs or whatever. So that's one of the big things in the state spec about carpet is specifically they're looking for trying to avoid health problems for their employees who are there forever. Food prep is a big deal. Apartments or whatever, again, odors, really. You have somebody who is from one culture living next to somebody from another culture, and when the wind blows in the opposite direction, they hate each other. Your house smells like curry, oh, your house smells like whatever, I mean, it's a funny thing, and property manager, you've got to deal with those kinds of things. In cases of buildings, I've had cases where we've had to re-engineer airflow in heating and cooling equipment because the restaurant's exhaust would blow this way, and then the air intake for the neighboring office would pull that air in, and they would say, we really like Mexican food, but we don't want to smell it from 8 to 5. And then you got to deal with that problem, right? I mean, because it doesn't smell bad until you're hungry at work and you're looking for like handfuls of cilantro at 8:30 a.m. because you're trying to figure out what's going on. Well, so I mean, that's a problem or an issue. Buildings can have all kinds of fume problems if they're not vented properly. So there's just a couple of terms you don't have to worry about, but building-related illness or sick building syndrome sometimes are because of the lack of airflow. We're trying to make things so energy efficient today that you don't get a lot of fresh air intake, and so if you don't, it might actually be an unhealthy place because germs and other kinds of stuff stays in there. How are you handling the garbage and recycling? Is your building offer recycling? What are you doing with fluorescent light bulbs? You can't just take fluorescent light bulbs and throw them in the dumpster. That's a hazardous waste. You gotta take them somewhere and pay to remove them. So these are things that you learn to deal with that, you know, are a big deal. How frequently are you replacing your emergency and exit light batteries? Is, you know, if the fire department comes out to inspect and those things are bad, you're gonna get cited, or at least have to have somebody come out and do them. So, you know, again, regular things you have to deal with. And when you replace them, what do you do with those batteries? You can't just throw those in the dumpster. I've had waste management companies literally return a full dumpster because they said, you know, there's stuff in there. Or I've had them come with just stuff. We pulled these batteries, or we pulled this full bottle of ammonia out of your garbage. How did they know it was our tenant's garbage? But they made that determination, and they brought the stuff back to the building. You know, you have to know how to handle waste and refuse anymore, and that varies all over the country. A lot of places in the country where they don't have single stream recycling like we do here. And you know, it's kind of funny, we have recycling in our building and then the tenants don't use it. I'll walk over to the garbage and there'll be bag after bag after bag of shredded paper. I'll walk over to the recycling and somebody's dumped their lawn, their leaves in it from home. I'm like, what is that? I gotta, you know, clean this stuff out and deal with it. I don't know what you do with lawn waste. There's really nothing else to do except for kind of spread it on the lawn because you can't get anybody to haul that. ADA, again, we'll talk about this briefly in chapter 21, but you know, you gotta make reasonable accommodations. Any business or any property management firm that has 15 or more employees is subject to ADA. A former student of mine, she worked for a property management firm, and they were on the second floor of an office building, and they were responsible for managing that building, and so they had a drill, and they told everybody ahead of time there was gonna be a fire drill on Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock, whatever the time was. And so everybody was there, and when, after the drill went, and they looked around, and this was awesome. People was orderly, everybody did great, until the light bulb went on, and they realized the one wheelchair-bound employee in their own firm was still upstairs because nobody brought him down. Oops. So, I mean, you need to practice these things, and you need to rehearse, and buildings need to be aware. And it's a huge deal. Making sure you have evacuation plans, you know, they're in the hallway here, right? You ever read those? Tell you which door to go to in the case of a fire. People die in fires because they get locked in stairwells or can't get out of the right place. Ever since 9/11 especially, and since a couple of high-rise fires, like the Cook County building downtown Chicago a few years ago, where people died in a stairwell, they went in to escape the fire, couldn't get out because all the doors were locked for security reasons to protect the tenants, and the people died of smoke inhalation in the stairwell of a building that really wasn't burning down where they worked every day. You know, these are property management related issues. It's a great way to make a living. It's a lot of fun, but there's a lot of responsibility. Risk management is part of what we do. So there's this nice acronym here, and you might get a test question like this at the state exam, I don't know. But so you have basically 4 options: avoid, control, transfer, or retain the risk. Notice that none of these is like do nothing. I mean, retaining the risk might sound like doing nothing, but you're consciously deciding to do it. So to avoid the risk is to remove the problem. You have a swimming pool in that apartment complex and hardly anybody uses it and it's a lot of risk and you want to get rid of it, just fill it in. When my brother was managing a 210-unit apartment complex in the city that we had redeveloped in the Pullman neighborhood in 1979, it was supposed to be a mix of market rent and subsidized rents. But the building very quickly went to all subsidized because the market rents never materialized as well as they had thought. So the swimming pool building, nobody could afford to pay for the money for the health club, so it sat empty for 15 or 20 years. It took 20 years till they could go to HUD to get enough grant money to tear the building down. That's removing the problem. Just tear down the building, dig up the pool, fill it all in, plant grass, make parking. That's avoiding the risk. Control the risk by being prepared, planning in advance. That's that evacuation plan. That's trying to figure out how are we going to handle this kind of thing, right? That sort of thing. Insurance or surety bonding is the way you transfer the risk to another party. Insurance is the most common example, right? We expect insurance companies to have large reserves, to have deep pockets. If something happens, they can write the check, and then we in effect pay them back in higher premiums over the following years. Surety is a little different. I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's a guarantee that some of the insurance companies provide, but it's different than insurance. Or you can retain the risk. This is that, sounds like you're doing nothing, but it's where you're deciding it's okay, we don't think a problem is going to exist, so we'll just leave it the way that it is. So until they could get the grant money to tear down the old building and fill in the pool for 20 years, that apartment complex just retained the risk. They didn't have another option, so they just kept it well locked, kept people out of there. We never had a drowning or an accident or a problem. And they just had the maintenance expense, which they wish they didn't have. Literally, that building was just never opened to that, the kind of use they expected it to be. And it was a big place. Tenant security is a big deal. It's getting to be a bigger and bigger deal all the time. This can range from, from terrorism on high-profile properties. If you think that's not an issue, go talk to people who manage the Willis Tower. They got a plan and think about that all the time. But also just simpler things, I was involved in the reconstruction of a lot of CHA housing complexes in the 80s and early 90s before they tore them to the ground. Do you know when the CHA projects were all built, there was no security access or entrance at all? So from the time they were built in the 1950s until the time that we started renovating them in the 1980s, anybody could walk in and walk up to an apartment door in a CHA complex. Would you live in an apartment building like that where there was no buzzer at the doors? So, I mean, it's pretty fundamental. No wonder, women in particular couldn't keep their exes or unwanted men out of their apartments. They had no way to keep them out. They would just literally camp on their doorstep. They couldn't get rid of them. Terrible way for anybody to live. So, I mean, how are you getting people out? Today we have scanners. We have people to screen people. We have automatic devices. There's security cards that you swipe for certain kinds of properties, all kinds of ways to deal with that thing. Fire protection systems. Are there sprinklers in this room that you're in? Are there overhead sprinklers in this room? Yes. Where? Those are concealed heads, right? So you don't see them, but they're here. Right? So if a fire were to erupt in any part of this building, right, the sprinklers would kick in. The heads would come down and the fire would hopefully be put out. So fire protection systems are really, really common. And more building codes are tending in this direction. Chicago has toyed with the idea of requiring fire protection in new house construction. That'll add a little cost that people haven't had to pay before. So you're going to see more and more systems because these systems save lives. What are you doing for lighting? Lighting is real fundamental to security, right? If the parking lot is dark, if you have dark corners, it's kind of scary even for somebody like me. So you want to have good interior lighting, good parking garage, good site lighting. This can cost money, but you need good, adequate lighting. It's not at all uncommon that you have homeless people decide to live in your parking lot, live in your parking garage, live on your front door because they need to go somewhere. What do they do to the Aurora Post Office every night at 8 o'clock? They not only lock the building, they gate the parking lot. So if you have a post office box in Aurora, the main post office in Aurora, you cannot collect your mail on Sunday. You cannot even drive into the parking lot on Sunday. They don't know what to do with the homeless population, so they just lock the building up more and more and more. That's part of their property management plan as the owners. They don't want people living in the space, and they don't even want people driving in and living in the parking lot. So they lock everything up so you can't get in there. You have a few wild pipe bombs here and there, and it kind of establishes your strategy as a property owner. So what your lighting is, what your access is, all these kinds of things, they really, really matter. You can have all kinds of guards and patrols. We have an armed guard on our building in Aurora because one of the state offices deals with child support. So they have an armed guard. It's always exciting. You can have unarmed guards, of course, and you can have all kinds of patrols. You can have people who are on site full time, or you can just have patrol that comes every hour, every 4 hours, whatever you want. You can have the police patrol. I won't let the police patrol our building because I don't want them giving me a ticket when I'm sitting, in the fire lane. So I won't allow it. I really don't want the city of Aurora on my property and all for reasons I won't go into, though I would love to. But the private property owners can give the police permission to ticket on private property. So if you're disobeying city traffic laws in a private parking lot, there's a possibility you could be ticketed by the police for that. The same as if you were on a public street. Talk about evac plans, weather alerts, intruder alert systems. I went to grad school in a couple of high rises downtown Chicago, and if there was somebody in that space in one of those buildings that wasn't supposed to be there, I'd get a text message. Classes might even be canceled, or you'd be told lock yourselves in your room. I don't know that we do quite that here, but we certainly have weather alerts at Wabansie, right, as part of the college's weather alert property management strategy. It's not licensed activity, but a lot of the stuff isn't licensed activity, but how are you gonna notify tenants if there are weather issues or problems? When we had a 3-foot blizzard in March a couple of years ago, you know, I had no idea how long it was gonna take us to clear that. This is, again, you know, just the oddity of this thing. So our building is L-shaped. It's roughly like this. Of course, you know, it has width to it. Out here is Indian Trail. This direction down here is north. This is south, so this is west, and this is east. It's upside down from what you would, you know, normally see it the way I've drawn this. Wind blows this way, typically. That's what we get here, winds that are, you know, out of the southwest, or they'll come from here, or they're from here. Every piece of garbage that anybody has deposited anywhere from Phoenix all the way up to this building blows up into here. When we had 3 feet of snow, this is the honest to God's truth. At the end of that, in the parking lot next door, they had a maximum of 8 inches. You know where all that snow was? All right up in here. We had 6 to 7 foot drifts up against this building. You know, a typical retail building with storefront glass and whatever, you couldn't see the windows. You couldn't, you know, just totally blown up underneath there. And, you know, we have a little snow plowing company that does this for us. They're a small firm. And to their credit, they got that building dug out and available within 2 days. I didn't know that we were gonna do 2 days. I don't have home phone numbers for people from Central Management Services for the state of Illinois. And I wouldn't have known how to reach them to tell them, don't come, we're still buried. But they knew to not come for a couple of days. But they called me on, like, you know, on the afternoon of the second day and said, we're coming back to work tomorrow morning. So, you know, we had to make sure that we could get that enough cleared, and it was very difficult to figure out where to put all that snow. So we lost a lot of spaces in here, like immediately. We couldn't clear it fast enough. You can bet everybody with a front end loader was busy picking up and dumping snow into trucks, or picking it up and dumping it into lawns, or even picking up and dumping it into a river to get it off of a bridge or a sidewalk or whatever. And we couldn't get anybody out there because they were all booked. But this building over here at the time was vacant, and this lot didn't have much snow. So I directed them, I just said, put all the snow you can over in that lot over there. And then they said, well, that's gonna be too much work. I said, okay, fine. Then leave that completely open, but, you know, and so they ended up dumping nothing there, and I changed the direction. I said, fine, then instead, just plow that whole lot. Which they could do really easily, because there's only 8 inches of snow. They could do it with their little truck. And that's where most of the people parked, because we lost half our spaces over here, half of them. Because snow was piled up, you know, super high, and with basically a pickup truck and a plow, you can only push so much weight. You just can't move any more than that. And when you're using a snow blower, all it does is blow everything out into the parking lot, so then you can sort of shove it. So anyway, you know, every building is a different exercise. So ultimately, we got the tenants in, but it was, you know, it was a challenge. You just don't know what you're going to get. You know, how are you going to tell your tenants don't come to work? Insurance types. Not going to test you on this. Suffice it to say, there's lots of different types. It's the kind of thing you need to be familiar with if you're going to manage property. Surety, I do want to talk to you about for just a minute because it relates specifically to property management. A surety, it's a service provided by an insurance company, but surety is not insurance. Surety is a guarantee. So like a bail bond, for example, is a surety. You get arrested for something and you have to put up 10 grand, you can buy a bond from an insurance company for $100 or whatever the cost is, and they guarantee you'll be there. And if you're not, they got to forfeit that money to the court, in which case then they come chase your ass down and bring you in or whatever so they can get their money back. In this particular case with property management, a fidelity bond makes a lot of sense because you're going to handle that owner's money. So if you're going to be handling, as in I am, for example, handling hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time of somebody else's money, what's their recourse if I decide, you know what, I don't care if I go to jail, I'm going to have a great time in the meantime, I'm taking the cash and I'm going to Aruba. What's their recourse? Because I wouldn't be able to repay the money. If I had a fidelity bond posted, then that would cover them for that, you know, for the embezzlement or expropriation of their funds. Same thing would be true for a property management company. Even if you had something as simple as cleaning people going in somebody else's office, what if they steal a priceless heirloom? Well, a fidelity bond would cover you for that kind of thing. Right? So that's a helpful thing to have. And payment and performance bonds are the kinds of things you probably want contractors to provide if they're doing major remodeling. Payment and performance bonds guarantee that the contractor will finish the work and that they will pay all of their material men and labor and all that kind of thing, so that there aren't mechanics liens placed against your property. So again, if you're gonna do this, knowing a little bit about bonding as well as insurance are important ideas. Know how to handle claims. We got 70% of the hail damage claim. Once I do the rest of the work, the other 30% will become available to us. I've seen property managers before forget about that, and 3 years later, when the time is up, they did the work, but they never submitted for the other 30%. Kind of shameful. Bunch of industry associations that all relate to this stuff. Again, they're just there out of the text or whatever that you can write down if you, or look up or whatever if you have interest in just a few names for you to look at. So I think that's pretty much it. Other questions at all for anything regarding leasing or property management? Anything we've talked about the last couple of classes? All right, just one last reminder, next week is spring break here, so there are no classes on Tuesday or Thursday. So I will see you back here on a week from Tuesday, right? A week and a half, basically. We'll do chapter 19, I think it is, and then the next night we do chapters 20 and 21. So you got plenty of time to read up on those. Even though we're a month away, it wouldn't be a bad idea for some of you to consider going back and re-looking at the stuff we talked about at the beginning of class, especially if you're busy and time challenged, because when we get to that 13th, 14th, 15th of April, you're going to have to be reteaching yourself all that stuff that is so easy to forget. So if you have time to do a little bit of that over the next week or so, it wouldn't hurt. I think you'll be surprised about all the stuff that you go, oh yeah, I forgot we talked about that. There's a lot of that in this course.